A revolution promised liberation, but what followed was emergency rule, famine that killed millions, and a system built on fear and labor camps. The superpower born of this violence expected to last forever. But in 1991, its leaders watched everything unravel almost overnight. How did a state forged through repression become so convinced of its own permanence, only to collapse without warning? The answer starts with the blood-soaked dawn of Soviet power. Armed workers and soldiers stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd on the night of October 25, 1917. The provisional government fell in hours. Lenin's new regime moved quickly, issuing decrees to seize land, nationalize banks, and silence opposition. Extraordinary powers became routine. On December 20th, 1917, the Bolsheviks created the Cheka, a secret police force led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. Its stated mission was to defend the revolution by any means necessary. Arrests, summary executions, and hostage-taking followed. Civil war erupted in 1918, pitting the Red Army against the Whites, foreign troops, and local uprisings. The Bolsheviks imposed war communism, banning private trade and ordering grain requisitions to feed cities and armies. Peasants faced armed detachments that confiscated harvests. Resistance was met with violence, villages blacklisted, families taken as hostages, and suspected enemies shot without trial. The Chekas' authority expanded rapidly. By 1920, its agents operated across the former empire, empowered to arrest, interrogate, and execute outside the courts. Official reports described thousands executed for counter-revolution, while others vanished into improvised detention camps. In the countryside, grain seizures sparked armed rebellions and mass flight. The Tambov uprising saw entire districts rise against Bolshevik rule, only to be crushed with poison gas and collective punishments. The famine of 1921 to 1922, triggered by war, requisitions, and drought, killed millions. Yet the machinery of emergency rule remained in place. The state's right to use violence against its own citizens was now embedded in law and practice. The security organs, first the Cheka, then its successors, became the backbone of the new order. Extraordinary measures justified by civil war became the template for decades of governance. The Soviet state was built not just on ideology, but on the normalization of coercion, surveillance, and the belief that survival depended on crushing all opposition. What began as emergency rule would become the foundation of Soviet power. By the late 1920s, the new Soviet leadership demanded not only obedience, but transformation. Stalin's government launched a campaign to force millions of peasants into collective farms, stripping them of land, livestock, and the right to decide their own futures. The state defined a new enemy, the kulak. The kulak was any peasant deemed too prosperous, too independent, or simply too resistant. By decree, kulaks were targeted for removal. OGPU security squads and local activists arrived in villages with lists, ordering families from their homes, seizing property, and loading entire households onto trains bound for Siberia or the Kazakh steppe. Livestock was slaughtered rather than surrendered. Grain, tools, and even seed for next year's planting were confiscated to meet impossible procurement quotas set in Moscow. Letters intercepted by censors told of barns emptied, children left with nothing, and neighbors turning on each other under the pressure of denunciation. In Ukraine and Kazakhstan, the grain harvests fell far short of targets, but quotas remained unchanged. The state sealed borders to prevent starving peasants from fleeing to cities. Blacklists condemned entire villages to hunger for failing to meet delivery norms. Internal party reports described swelling numbers of deaths, bodies left unburied, and desperate attempts to forage for food. Between 1932 and 1933, famine swept across the Soviet countryside. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the USSR, lost an estimated 3 to 4 million people. Kazakhstan's nomadic herders, forced into permanent settlements, saw as much as 1/3 of their population perish. Across the Soviet Union, the death toll from famine and forced collectivization reached between 5 and 7 million. Despite mounting evidence of catastrophe, grain exports continued, fueling industrialization and paying foreign debts. Scholars still debate whether the famine in Ukraine was a targeted act of genocide or the result of reckless, brutal policy applied across the Union. What remains clear is that the drive to modernize came at a staggering human cost. The countryside was left traumatized, its social fabric torn apart, and a vast pool of displaced people created, many destined for the expanding labor camps that would soon become another pillar of Soviet power. Barbed wire and watchtowers stretched across the frozen north, marking the boundaries of a system that would come to define Soviet power. Gulag. By the early 1930s, labor camps multiplied rapidly, absorbing waves of prisoners swept up by collectivization, purges, and quotas for enemies of the people. Over the next decades, nearly 18 million men and women passed through this network of camps and colonies. Their crime might be as simple as keeping back a few ears of grain, making a careless remark, or being labeled a kulak. For many, the journey ended in Siberian forests, Arctic mines, or the gold fields of Kolyma. Forced labor became a cornerstone of Soviet industrial ambition. Prisoners built the White Sea and Baltic Canal, a project completed in just 20 months at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. They laid railways across permafrost, dug coal and copper from the earth, felled timber for export, and mined gold in regions where winter temperatures plunged below -50 degrees. The state depended on this labor to fulfill the impossible targets of the 5-year plans, often sacrificing lives for speed and scale. Official reports boasted of canals and factories rising from wilderness, but rarely mentioned the graves that lined their foundations. Camp commanders set daily work quotas with little regard for the prisoners' health or survival. Rations were tied to output. Those who met targets received thin soup and black bread, while the weak and sick starved. Letters smuggled from the camps spoke of frostbite and exhaustion, of men collapsing at their posts, and of guards indifferent to suffering. The Gulag's economy was vast. At its peak, it supplied nearly a quarter of the country's gold and significant shares of timber, coal, and other resources. Yet inefficiency and waste were rampant. Projects like the White Sea and Baltic Canal, dug by hand in brutal conditions, proved almost useless for modern shipping. The Gulag was not just a tool of punishment, but a pillar of economic strategy. It allowed the state to harness millions under threat of violence, binding terror to the machinery of growth. For the families left behind, the camps meant silence and fear, a warning that resistance or even suspicion could mean disappearance. In this way, forced labor became woven into the Soviet model, not as a secret, but as an open fact of life, shaping the country's development and the culture of fear that would soon reach every level of society. On July 30th, 1937, the Soviet Politburo approved an order from the NKVD, Order number 00447. That directive set in motion the largest wave of state violence in Soviet history. The order listed categories of people to be targeted: former kulaks, ex-prisoners, so-called criminal elements, and anyone labeled an anti-Soviet element. What set this operation apart was its method. Each region received fixed quotas: how many people to arrest, how many to shoot, and how many to send to labor camps. The numbers were not based on investigations or evidence. They were set by Moscow, and regional chiefs who failed to meet or exceed their quotas risked being denounced as disloyal themselves. The NKVD, under Nikolai Yezhov, created a system to process the accused at speed. Local troikas, three-man commissions made up of the regional NKVD chief, a party secretary, and the prosecutor, met in closed sessions. There were no trials, no defense, and no appeals. Files were reviewed, accusations summarized, and sentences handed down in minutes. In some regions, hundreds could be sentenced in a single meeting. The pace was relentless, the logic mechanical. Quotas varied by region. In areas with large populations of former kulaks or national minorities, the numbers were especially high. The Ukrainian SSR and border oblasts received some of the highest targets, reflecting Stalin's fears of sabotage and foreign influence. If a region fulfilled its quota quickly, it could request an increase. These requests were almost always granted. The system rewarded over-fulfillment and punished hesitation. Order number 00447 divided the accused into two categories. The first was for immediate execution. The second was for 10 years in the camps. In the first year alone, nearly 800,000 people were arrested under this order. Around 380,000 were shot, often within days of their sentencing. The rest vanished into the Gulag. The process was so opaque that families often learned nothing, only that a relative had disappeared. Denunciations multiplied as fear spread. Colleagues, neighbors, and even family members turned each other in, sometimes out of conviction, sometimes to protect themselves. The NKVD encouraged this climate, treating every complaint as a potential lead. The entire system became self-perpetuating. Local officials, desperate to avoid suspicion, found new enemies to fill the lists. The more arrests, the safer the accusers felt, at least for a while. Inside the security apparatus, the pressure was intense. Yezhov's own officers knew that failing to meet expectations could mean joining the ranks of the accused. Even the NKVD was not immune. Hundreds of its own personnel were arrested during the operation. The logic of suspicion spiraled outward, consuming not just class enemies, but party members, engineers, teachers, and military officers. The Great Purge reached deep into the Red Army, removing experienced commanders and sowing distrust, just as Europe edged toward war. The consequences would be felt on the battlefield within a few years. But in 1937 and 1938, the priority was total control. The culture of fear became institutionalized as quotas and secrecy replaced law and evidence. Order number 00447 was not just a tool of repression. It was a blueprint for mechanized terror, where human lives became numbers on a form and the machinery of the state ran on fear. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the country faced destruction on a scale few could imagine. Cities burned, villages vanished, and entire populations were uprooted. In the first months of the war, millions of Red Army soldiers fell in battle or were taken prisoner. Civilian losses mounted just as quickly. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and would last nearly 900 days. Inside the encircled city, food rations dropped to 125 grams of bread a day, often made with sawdust or cellulose. Hospitals filled with the starving. Diaries from the blockade describe families watching loved ones die one by one, neighbors boiling wallpaper paste for calories, and children left alone in freezing apartments. By the time the siege lifted in January 1944, nearly 1 million people had died in Leningrad, most from hunger and cold. Across the front, the Red Army absorbed blow after blow. Battles at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. At Stalingrad, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians became casualties as entire city blocks were reduced to rubble. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, cost the Red Army and its enemies hundreds of thousands more. By war's end, the Soviet Union had lost at least 26 million people, soldiers, partisans, prisoners, and civilians. The scale of loss was staggering. More than 1 in 8 Soviet citizens died. In places like Belarus and Western Russia, entire villages disappeared. In Ukraine, mass graves marked the sites of massacres and reprisals. Every family, every street bore scars from the fighting. Leadership in Moscow made hard choices about survival. Secret memos prioritized ammunition and fuel for the front, often at the expense of food for civilians. The road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga kept Leningrad alive, ferrying weapons and key workers, while rations for the general population remained meager. Propaganda posters promised victory and unity, but the reality was a society stretched to the breaking point. Still, the government demanded and often received total mobilization. Factories were dismantled and shipped east beyond the Urals. Women and children worked double shifts, building tanks and shells in cities far from the front lines. The state revived old patriotic symbols, blending Soviet slogans with appeals to defend the motherland. Survival depended on sacrifice. The victory over Nazi Germany became the foundation of Soviet pride and legitimacy. The cost, though, was almost beyond comprehension. For decades, the story of sacrifice justified the state's power and its demands. War medals and parades honored the fallen, while the pain and loss became part of the national identity. The memory of endurance under siege, of families torn apart by battle and famine, shaped how leaders and citizens saw their country. The regime pointed to victory as proof that its system worked, even as the wounds of war ran deep and the true price was measured in millions of lives. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union stood at the center of a new world order. Red Army divisions stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans, their presence felt in every capital from Warsaw to Sofia. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at Semipalatinsk, shattering the Western monopoly on nuclear weapons. The shockwaves reached far beyond the test site. For the first time, the Kremlin possessed a weapon that could level entire cities, and Soviet leaders believed this achievement secured their place alongside the United States as a global power. Within months, the boundaries of post-war Europe hardened. Communist parties, backed by Soviet advisors and security forces, took control of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Elections were managed, opposition silenced, and local police restructured under Moscow's guidance. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact formalized this sphere of influence, binding the Eastern Bloc together in a military alliance designed to counter NATO. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a metaphor. It was a reality enforced by soldiers, barbed wire, and secret police. The Soviet leadership, now a collective of party veterans, saw these triumphs as proof of the system's strength. The memory of wartime devastation was still fresh, but the narrative had shifted. The sacrifices of millions had delivered not only survival, but dominance. The atomic bomb, parades of tanks through Red Square, and the red flags flying over half of Europe all reinforced a sense of invulnerability. Soviet textbooks described the USSR as the world's first socialist state, leading humanity toward a new future. Behind closed doors, Politburo members spoke with growing confidence. With nuclear parity and an empire stretching from Berlin to Vladivostok, they believed the Soviet order was permanent, unassailable by outside threats or internal dissent. The machinery of control, security services, party committees, and loyal armies seemed to guarantee stability for generations to come. By the late 1960s, Soviet leadership stood on the foundation of victory and empire, but the system itself had begun to tire. Official doctrine described the Soviet Union as a society of developed socialism, a phrase enshrined in the 1977 Constitution. The Communist Party, now the only legal political force, claimed to embody the will of the people and the logic of history. Yet behind the slogans, a different reality took shape. Factories that once symbolized progress now struggled with outdated machinery and chronic shortages. Central planning, designed for rapid mobilization, became rigid and unresponsive. Gosplan set targets for steel and tractors, but everyday goods such as meat, shoes, and soap remained scarce. Shoppers queued for hours, and the promise of abundance faded into routine disappointment. Official statistics reported growth, but internal reports warned of stagnation. By the mid-1970s, economic growth slowed to a crawl, with many years barely reaching 2%. Beneath the surface, a privileged class flourished. Party officials and senior managers enjoyed access to special stores, better housing, and vacation dachas. The gap between the rhetoric of equality and the reality of privilege grew wider. For most citizens, advancement depended less on talent than on loyalty and connections. The shadow economy, BLAT, became essential for securing everyday necessities. Corruption and informal deals filled the gaps left by the planned system. The 1977 Constitution codified this new normal. It declared the Soviet Union a state of the whole people, led by the Communist Party, and promised that socialism had reached its mature stage. The language of progress masked a creeping sense of fatigue. Ideology hardened into ritual, repeated in meetings and parades but rarely believed. Dissent, though still dangerous, never fully disappeared. Writers, scientists, and workers circulated samizdat literature and whispered doubts about the future. Official optimism endured, but the system's cracks were visible. The Soviet Union appeared stable, even inevitable, but the cost of maintaining that image grew heavier with each passing year. Military spending dominated Soviet economic life by the late 1970s. Internal budget memos stamped for Politburo eyes only revealed that nearly 1/6 of the country's entire output went to the armed forces, more than twice the share spent by the United States. The drive for nuclear parity, global deployments, and a sprawling military-industrial complex left fewer resources for housing, food, and consumer goods. As factories churned out missiles and tanks, queues for meat and soap grew longer, and the promise of a better life faded into routine frustration. Behind closed doors, senior officials argued over the cost of the arms race. Reports from the Ministry of Finance warned that keeping pace with American weapons programs would mean permanent shortages at home. The bitter joke among Gorbachev's advisors was that they were producing tanks when they needed tractors, yet the leadership, aging and insulated, clung to the belief that military strength guaranteed survival. Few dared to question the wisdom of matching every American advance, even as growth slowed to a crawl. In December 1979, Soviet troops crossed into Afghanistan. The Politburo hoped for a quick intervention to prop up a faltering ally. Instead, the war dragged on for nearly a decade. Young conscripts, many barely 19, wrote home about burned villages, ambushes in mountain passes, and commanders who could not explain why they were there. Official reports counted 13,833 Soviet dead, with more than 50,000 wounded or maimed. Veterans returned to a country that often ignored their suffering, their letters and stories fueling quiet anger. The Afghan war drained resources and morale. It exposed the limits of Soviet power, both abroad and at home. By the time Gorbachev's circle began to talk openly about reform, the strain was visible everywhere, in empty shops, in worn faces, in the silence that followed news of another funeral. Inside the Kremlin, some recognized that the burden of empire and arms was unsustainable, but the system they had built offered few ways to change course without risking everything. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, promising to revive a stagnant country. He spoke of perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost, a new openness meant to restore public trust and modernize socialism. Gorbachev's speeches called for honest criticism, freer discussion, and an end to the silence that had surrounded the party's mistakes. Soviet newspapers and television, once tightly controlled, began publishing stories that would have been unthinkable just months before: exposés of corruption, accounts of the Gulag, and the first public debates over Stalinist crimes. Dissident writers and historians found their works in print, and millions read about the famine of the 1930s or the purges from 1937 to 1938 for the first time. The promise of glasnost was clarity, but the effect was destabilizing. As the media uncovered decades of secrecy and suffering, the official narrative that had justified the party's rule began to unravel. Instead of renewing faith in the system, openness exposed its deepest wounds. People learned about the true scale of the famine from 1932 to 1933, the millions lost in labor camps, and the lies that had shaped their understanding of the past. The gap between propaganda and reality widened every day. For many, the sense of betrayal ran deep. In April 1986, disaster struck at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. A reactor explosion sent radioactive clouds across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Local officials, following old habits, delayed warnings and downplayed the scale of the accident. Evacuations were slow. For days, the world learned more about the fallout from foreign news than from Soviet authorities. Only after radiation alarms sounded in Sweden did the Kremlin acknowledge the crisis. Gorbachev, under pressure from both international scrutiny and his own advisors, ordered a fuller accounting. The televised images of abandoned towns and sick children became a turning point. Chernobyl laid bare the cost of secrecy and the dangers of a system that valued control over truth. Glasnost, once a slogan, became a reality that could not be contained. Newspapers published lists of those executed in the purges. Television aired interviews with camp survivors. People wrote letters to editors describing family members lost to famine or repression. The party's claim to moral leadership, built on victory in war and promises of justice, now had to answer for decades of concealed suffering. Glasnost forced an accounting the system could not avoid. Inside the leadership, the mood shifted from confidence to anxiety. Gorbachev's advisors debated how much openness was too much. Some argued that exposing the past would only strengthen the party by clearing the air. Others saw the risk. As faith in the system faded, calls for deeper reform and even independence in the republics grew louder. The old machinery of censorship could not be rebuilt. By 1988, the press was filled with debates once confined to kitchens and samizdat. The names of the dead, the stories of the disappeared, and the failures of central planning became public knowledge. The party's authority, long protected by silence and fear, now faced a society that demanded answers. Glasnost had begun as a controlled experiment in truth-telling. It became the force that exposed the foundations of Soviet power and left them open to challenge. At dawn on August 19, 1991, Soviet radio and television interrupted regular programming to announce a state of emergency. The State Committee on the State of Emergency, known by its Russian initials GKHP, declared that President Gorbachev was unable to perform his duties for health reasons. In reality, Gorbachev was under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea, his communications cut by a delegation of KGB and military officials the previous evening. The GKTHP, led by Vice President Gennady Yanayev, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, KGB Chairman Vladimir Krukov, and Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, issued Decree No. 1, introducing emergency rule in Moscow and several other regions. Tanks and armored vehicles rolled into the capital, taking positions around the Kremlin, television studios, and the Russian White House, the seat of the Russian Federation's government. Inside the White House, Boris Yeltsin, recently elected president of the Russian Republic, gathered with his advisors and supporters. As armored columns arrived, Yeltsin issued a decree denouncing the GKHP's actions as an unconstitutional coup d'etat and called for a general strike. He climbed onto a tank outside the building, reading his appeal to the crowd and the world's cameras, urging citizens and soldiers to resist. Throughout the day, tens of thousands gathered at the White House, building barricades from trolley buses and construction materials. Some military units refused orders to storm the building or defected to the defenders. Others waited for clear instructions that never arrived. The coup leaders, appearing tense and uncertain at a televised press conference, struggled to project authority. On August 20th, the planned signing of the new Union Treaty, designed to devolve power to the republics, did not take place. The city braced for violence. That night, armored personnel carriers attempted to break through a tunnel near the White House. In the chaos, 3 civilians were killed. Their deaths, broadcast and discussed across the city, deepened the sense that the old order was unraveling. By the morning of August 21st, 1991, Defense Minister Yazov ordered troops to withdraw from Moscow. The GKCHP leadership began to disperse. Some tried to flee, others were detained by loyalist forces. Gorbachev returned to Moscow that night, but the center's authority had collapsed in less than 72 hours. The aftermath was swift. On August 23rd, Yeltsin suspended the Communist Party on Russian territory and seized its property. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary the next day. Over the following weeks and months, Republican parliaments asserted control over ministries, property, and armed forces. The central institutions of the Soviet Union became hollow, their power flowing to the republics. By December, the process reached its legal conclusion. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a state dacha in the Belovezh forest. They signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality. The Commonwealth of Independent States was created in its place. The Russian parliament ratified the agreement on December 12, 1991, and formally withdrew from the 1922 treaty that had created the USSR. Within days, 8 more republics joined the new Commonwealth at Alma-Ata, agreeing that the Soviet Union was finished. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR, acknowledging the end of the state he had tried to reform. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. On December 26, 1991, the upper chamber of the Soviet parliament passed a declaration recognizing the dissolution of the Union and terminated its own existence. No final war, no mass crackdown, just a series of decrees, signatures, and televised addresses. The empire built through violence and fear dissolved in a matter of days. Its collapse was sudden, and its rise had been brutal. For millions, the meaning of the state and the future was rewritten almost overnight. 3 decades on, the Soviet collapse still haunts global politics. Today, more than 280 million people live in the former Soviet Union, navigating the legacies of abrupt upheaval and unaccounted trauma. The illusion of unshakable power can blind any system to its own fragility. As new states and old empires test their limits, one truth endures: no order built on fear remains permanent. History's next turning point often arrives unseen. Share your thoughts on what comes next below.